Today we're at Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, but since we can never let well enough alone, we started wondering what happens if Lincoln needs a facelift.
For nearly a century, Mount Rushmore has stood as a symbol of power and pride, its four faces carved deep into the Black Hills. But when Grok AI was asked to scan the monument, it uncovered details that most people overlook: traces of ambition, conflict, and secrets hidden in plain sight.
Six Chiefs is the name of this mountain. Our people are still on our reservations, still dealing with the traumas that came across the country with the United States government.
What was supposed to be a simple analysis became something far more unsettling. Was this monument really finished? Or is its story still unfolding beneath the stone? The answer will make you see it differently. The mountain before the presidents. Long before chisels, dynamite, and scaffolding scarred its face, the granite peak that would become Mount Rushmore already held profound meaning. To the Lakota people, it was known as the Six Grandfathers, a name honoring their six sacred directional spirits. The mountain was not just rock, it was a living part of their cultural and spiritual identity. Oral traditions describe the Black Hills as the place of origin for the Lakota, a sacred homeland where life itself emerged. The Six Grandfathers towered over this landscape as both landmark and sanctuary, embodying connection to ancestors, cosmology, and survival. Archaeological evidence shows native people had inhabited the Black Hills for at least 10,000 years, building a deep relationship with the land. To outsiders, it may have looked like empty wilderness. To the Lakota and other Plains tribes, it was a place of memory, ceremony, and renewal. Generations gathered there for sacred rituals, forging bonds that reached far beyond physical geography. This bond made what happened in the 1800s feel like a wound that never healed. As settlers pushed westward, U.S. expansion collided violently with indigenous sovereignty. The government signed treaties it routinely broke, and none carried more weight than the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. After years of war, this treaty established that the Black Hills and surrounding territory would be set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux Nation. In exchange, the Lakota agreed to safe passage for travelers and to certain conditions aimed at assimilation. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was a binding agreement, at least on paper. Years later, that promise would be shattered. In 1874, even General George Armstrong Custer, when he was sent with an exploring party to the Black Hills, confirmed what was rumored among settlers: there was gold. That outbreak triggered the rush of miners, camps, and military support. The conflict surfaced again in 1876 and culminated in the defeat of the Lakota. Shortly afterward, Congress enacted laws to confiscate the Black Hills outright, deeming this illegal but never reversing the act. For the Lakota, it was not only a betrayal of the treaty, but also a desecration of their most sacred land. You might already know this history, but this is where Grok AI's scan has brought a different lens. When asked to analyze Mount Rushmore, Grok didn't just parse the stone faces. It drew connections between physical data and historical records. The patterns of displacement were noted by the AI, thus highlighting how the carving of the monument layered conquest directly onto a sacred site. In fact, to Grok, this monument is more than a patriotic iconic emblem or wonder of engineering. It is also a symbol of erasure, written literally over the Lakota's six grandfathers. The way it's framed almost forces us to see the mountain as more than a stage for presidential faces. Before the faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt were carved into it, there were other stories here, some that Grok noted being overshadowed. It was noted that landscapes are records of history as much as the written word, and the six grandfathers carried meanings long before the drills and hammers arrived. Grok positioned the sacred significance of the mountain, something all but ignored by tourist brochures, between that line and Mount Rushmore itself. The monument to the spirit and survival of the Lakota, which Mount Rushmore started out as, ceased to exist the moment dynamite began blasting its way through granite and remains in contention to this day. What Grok highlighted next wasn't just history, it was the man who reshaped it. the sculptor and the shadow. If the Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota, the man who imposed his vision on them saw only a blank canvas. Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor behind Mount Rushmore, was as ambitious as he was controversial. To his supporters, he was a genius obsessed with scale and permanence. To his critics, he was a man whose ego and politics left scars not only on stone, but on history itself. Grok AI's analysis didn't just spotlight his technical achievements, it drew lines between his personal ideology and the monument's final form. Borglum's resume before Mount Rushmore was already polarizing. He had worked on the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain, Georgia, where he collaborated with members of the Ku Klux Klan and supported their fundraising efforts. Though he would later clash with his patrons there and leave the project unfinished, the association followed him. It wasn't just a footnote in his biography, it was a shadow. Grok flagged this connection as vital context, showing how Borglum's worldview bled into his choice of subjects and symbols. What makes this more striking is what Mount Rushmore might have been. Early proposals suggested the monument could include native leaders like Chief Red Cloud, a way to represent the region's fuller history. That vision didn't survive Borglum's involvement. He insisted on celebrating U.S. presidents he admired: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. Each, in their way, symbolized American expansion, governance, and power. For Borglum, this was a story of greatness. For the Lakota, it was a story of displacement written in granite. Grok's scan focused on this erasure. In laying bare the early designs, historical letters, and Borglum's final plans, AI provided clarity on how the exclusion of indigenous representation was both intentional and deliberate. This was not ignorance, but rather choice. As far as Borglum was concerned, the monument should glorify his vision of America, one with conquest and triumph, not that of shared history or reconciliation. His mindset even found expression in scale. In Borglum's mind, the torsos disappeared into the mountain, with inscriptions and a hall of records concealed behind the faces to enshrine American achievement. Never mind the unfinished state. His vision spoke loudly of how he saw himself, not merely as an artist, but as an architect of national myth. Grok flagged his obsession with permanence and legacy as an indicator. Mount Rushmore was as much about the vanity of Borglum as it was about the presidents he carved. While the reputation as a sculptor cannot be contested, politics and prejudices equally stick to this monument. Grok's contextual analysis turned Borglum less from a neutral artist into a much more active shaper of ideology. Every blast of dynamite and etched granite lines was not only art, but also a narrative silencing certain voices while amplifying others. Therefore, Mount Rushmore is not only about its time, but is clear by Borglum's vision, the vision that was steeped in exclusion, ambition, and some shadows that linger near Borglum long after his demise. The AI made its observations clear that one should first understand the man who shaped it to understand the monument. And if the man behind the monument was controversial, so too were the figures he immortalized: faces of power, faces of violence. To millions of visitors, the four granite faces on Mount Rushmore represent vision, leadership, and the endurance of American democracy. But Grok AI's analysis reminded us that the legacies of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt are not carved in stone without cracks. Each president had policies and actions that carried devastating consequences for indigenous people. By cross-referencing historical records, Grok highlighted the irony. The very leaders chosen to symbolize freedom had also advanced systems of oppression on the lands where their faces now loom. Take George Washington, often called the father of the nation. To the Iroquois Confederacy, he was known by a darker name, Town Destroyer. In 1779, he ordered scorched earth campaigns that destroyed about 40 villages, burning homes, crops, and food supplies to break the resistance of native communities. Grok flagged this as more than historical detail. It was a direct contradiction. The first face on Mount Rushmore belonged to a leader who expanded liberty for colonists, but waged war on the original inhabitants of the land. Then there was Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Grok drew attention to his role in shaping U.S. expansion policies, including the Louisiana Purchase, which opened vast indigenous lands to settlers. Jefferson spoke of native peoples as subjects who could be civilized or else removed. His policies laid the groundwork for forced displacement, a pattern that would culminate decades later in the Trail of Tears. To carve his likeness into the Lakota's sacred mountain was, Grok suggested, a double erasure of the land's original meaning and of those displaced to build Jefferson's vision of America. While Abraham Lincoln is remembered for ending slavery and preserving the Union, his relations with native peoples are often ignored. In 1862, he sanctioned the mass execution of 38 Dakota men in Minnesota whose communities were starving from the ravages of an unjust war on account of broken treaties. To this day, it remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history. As Grok's analysis pointed out, Lincoln's idea of justice was rather selective, granting liberty to some and sanctioning violence against others. His monument on Mount Rushmore stands for unity while increasingly disrupting native communities through his acts. The last of them, Theodore Roosevelt, whose face is carved the deepest into the mountain, also held a legacy of aggression in expansionism. He promoted assimilation policies, being the one to say, "I don't go so far as to think the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are." This, Grok asserted, was one of the most flagrant examples of racism inscribed in the collective memory of the nation. For Roosevelt, the American frontier was a proving ground for greatness, but for indigenous people, it was a battleground for survival. Grok made the monument ironic by scanning records, cross-referencing treaties, and mapping historical timelines. The carved land taken from the Sioux, but memorializing leaders whose legacies include displacing native nations. The stone itself was not laid on new accusations, it merely laid history over the stone. In doing that, it redefined Mount Rushmore less as a patriotic symbol and more as a contested narrative. To the tourist's eyes, the 4 visages might strike as stoic and uniform. But Grok's analysis suggested that each carries untapped contradictions: liberty and oppression, unity and division, pride and pain. Together, they form not simply a monument to presidents, but a reminder of the costs hidden behind the face of the national story. But Grok didn't just reveal legacies, it highlighted what remains unfinished: rubble, ruins, and unfinished plans. Visitors to Mount Rushmore usually lift their eyes to the 4 presidents, but what lies beneath tells another story, one often ignored in the glossy postcards. From 1927 to 1941, about 400 workers blasted 450,000 tons of rock off the mountainside with dynamite and drills. What the brochures rarely mention is that all that debris wasn't neatly removed. It remains piled beneath the carving, a scar at the base of the monument, reminding us that this project was never polished into completion. Grok AI's analysis flagged this rubble as significant, not just leftover stone, but evidence of an unfinished dream. The original vision by Gutzon Borglum was far more ambitious than what we see today. He planned for the figures to have torsos extending down to their waists, complete with inscriptions and a grand backdrop celebrating American expansion. But Borglum's death in 1941, coupled with war funding shortages, brought the project to a halt. What we have now are only partial portraits, heads without bodies, visions without closure. Grok noted the visual asymmetry and compared archival sketches to the final result, underscoring how much of the monument was left on the drawing board. And still, the holiest of holies is the Hall of Records, one of Borglum's fanciest ideas. Concealed behind Lincoln's head, he imagined a secret room that would contain the entire story of America, documents, artifacts, and a narrative, and would last millennia. Workers began tunneling in 1938, but it was abandoned, and today it remains sealed, unfinished, and inaccessible. Grok tagged this space as a curious oddity, a literal void inside the mountain. a space embodying an otherwise gap between towering ambition and practical limits. When overlaid with a historical construction map under 3D terrain data, Grok flagged these sections as having some irregularities with respect to the unfinished, while at the same time running through formations of statistical evidence from above. The AI noted how these unfinished renderings, abandoned caverns, and debris piles signify not only incomplete form, but fractured intention. Mount Rushmore was intended to articulate coalescence and permanence. The debris left behind speaks of disruption and compromise. Greatness is partial in an unfinished reality. Visitors marvel at the summit heads gazing away from the decimated stones below. In Grok's opinion, the debris is as much a part of the narrative as the refined carvings, crowding out ideas of haste, imperfection, and abandonment. One is forced to ask, if the monument is unfinished, surely its story is also unfinished. It is hard to escape the irony. Borglum had intended to erect a timeless apotheosis to the American ideals. But what is left are remnants, heads without bodies, tunnels without an archive, stone heaps without cognizance. Grok's analysis turned these absences away from being footnotes to being precisely where we must begin understanding Mount Rushmore. The monument was never complete, and it was quite possibly never meant to be what it came to be. To Grok, the debris field became more than a geological phenomenon. It spoke of levels of human aspiration being confronted by human limitation. Each boulder at the base is a fragment of a larger dream, a mute witness to those who labored with faith in a vision they would never see fulfilled. The debris thus tells us about these grand monuments being as much about what is above, as much about what fails to rise, and is discarded below the fragments of a story edited out of sight. In this way, Mount Rushmore, simultaneously, is a perfect success and a dismal failure. Yet the AI also flagged something stranger, what lies beneath Mount Rushmore: hidden chambers and secret agendas. Behind Abraham Lincoln's stony gaze lies one of the strangest and least discussed features of Mount Rushmore: a hidden tunnel carved deep into the granite. Known as the Hall of Records, this unfinished chamber was Gutzon Borglum's audacious attempt to create a vault of American memory, a place where future generations, or even civilizations thousands of years from now, could uncover the story of the United States. Grok AI's scan placed particular focus here, flagging it as more than architectural trivia. It saw it as the symbolic heart of the monument's contradictions, where ambition, myth-making, and erasure collide. Borglum's idea was monumental in scale. He envisioned a cathedral-like chamber lined with bronze and glass cabinets filled with copies of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and detailed biographies of the presidents carved on the mountain. This was not just about creating art. It was about sealing a legacy. Borglum wanted Mount Rushmore to outlast civilizations, to become a beacon for anyone, human or otherwise, who might stumble across it millennia later. The Hall of Records, in his mind, would tell them what America stood for. But reality intervened. By the late 1930s, as global tensions escalated, funding shifted to wartime priorities. Borglum's death in 1941 sealed the fate of the chamber. What remains is a rough-hewn 70-foot tunnel, drilled into the mountain and abandoned mid-dream. It leads nowhere, an empty passage hidden behind Lincoln's head. To Grok's analytical lens, this was not just unfinished stonework. It was a metaphor. A monument meant to enshrine America's ideals now carried a hollow chamber at its core, a reminder of promises started but never completed. Decades later, in 1998, a partial version of Borglum's plan resurfaced. The U.S. government installed a titanium vault inside the chamber, sealed with porcelain enamel panels. On them are inscribed the founding texts, presidential biographies, and a history of Mount Rushmore itself. To most, this might seem like Borglum's vision finally realized. But Grok flagged a glaring omission. No mention of the Lakota, no acknowledgement of broken treaties, no recognition that the monument itself stands on contested land. The Hall of Records preserves one narrative while erasing another. That selective memory has created some serious reflection. Is the Hall of Records simply a neutral time capsule, or always intended to be such a curated myth? In comparing it to other national archives and monuments, Grok thus recognized a pattern. Preservation projects that privileged the voices of the dominant culture relegated much of indigenous history and voices. To that end, we find something of a political argument through the AI argues for just how much we choose to remember. For in equal measure, it implies how much we choose to forget. And Grok didn't just limit itself to that feature. The 3D geological scan showed some faint anomalies in the rock around it. Small cavities, fissures, and irregularities which many geologists interpret as pointing at possible additional voids. Those were generally considered by experts to be natural fractures, but Grok, qualifying them as non-trivial, meant that their orientation raised questions. Were other hidden chambers started but never completed? Or is the very idea of secret spaces part of the monument's mythology, a mirror of how humans project mystery into silence? It is the tale of two cities. One side shows Mount Rushmore as a shrine of patriotism, a veritable celebration of democracy engraved into the granite of the Black Hills. The other shows it as a hollowed mountain, an unfinished chamber that speaks more of absence than of presence, more of exclusion than of inclusion. Grok had it as no accident. The monument is as much about what it hides as it is about what it reveals. Today, the Hall of Records is sealed, a secret chamber most tourists will never visit. Instead of a completed archive, it merely reminds us whose stories can get carved into permanence and whose will be left outside the walls. And while the hidden chambers hint at buried narratives, the real story may lie with those who never accepted the monument at all. The billion-dollar refusal. If Mount Rushmore is a monument to presidents, it is also a monument to broken promises. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie granted the Black Hills to the Sioux Nation, guaranteeing their sovereignty over this sacred land. The treaty was clear. This territory belonged to the Sioux, not as a gift, but as recognition of their right to exist on their ancestral homeland. Yet, just 7 years later, when prospectors discovered gold in the Black Hills, the U.S. government abandoned its own word. Miners poured into the area, soldiers followed, and the land was seized outright. By its own agreements, this act was illegal. For the Sioux, it was not only theft, it was betrayal. And that betrayal has never been forgotten. Grok AI's analysis flagged this treaty breach as the foundation of every modern dispute over Mount Rushmore. It reminded us that the mountain wasn't just carved into granite, it was carved into stolen land. Every tourist who gazes up at the four presidential faces is, whether they realize it or not, looking at a monument that stands on top of a broken promise. The battle over the Black Hills moved from battlefields to courtrooms in the 20th century. After decades of legal fights, the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980. The decision was stunning in its clarity. The Black Hills had been taken unlawfully, and the Sioux were entitled to compensation. The original award was $105 million, a figure meant to represent the 1877 land value plus interest. But as the settlement sat untouched, it grew. With decades of accrual, that sum has now swelled to over $1.5 billion. To most nations or communities, this would be seen as a historic victory. Justice translated into wealth, a chance to rebuild, with resources long denied. But the Sioux refused the money. Why? Accepting the settlement would mean legally relinquishing their claim to the Black Hills. For the Sioux, this was never about money. It was about meaning. The land was sacred, tied to their spiritual identity, cultural continuity, and origin stories. To take the payout would be to endorse the idea that sacredness has a price tag. As one Sioux leader put it, the Black Hills are not for sale. Grok highlighted this refusal as one of the most powerful acts of resistance in modern history. In a world where most disputes are closed with financial settlements, the Sioux chose principle over payment. That refusal left the Black Hills dangling in some morally and politically strange limbo. Federal law still treats the monument as a patriotic monument and a tourist attraction, while the Sioux view it as a desecration, a monument carved into their most sacred mountain, commemorating leaders who put in place policies of displacement and assimilation. Grok's contextual analysis emphasized that it is not simply historical tensions, it is an unresolved, ongoing battle that is felt beneath the collective flash of cameras and souvenir purchases at the site. Yet, that million-dollar question remains: what happens now? Internal opinions among the Sioux leadership are far from unanimous. Some demand that the land should be returned in its entirety and that the Treaty of 1868 should be restored to speak of the sovereignty of the Indians. Others envisage co-management, a relationship of shared stewardship whereby tribal authorities could jointly manage sacred sites with federal agencies. Some would like to see some degree of symbolic recognition, expanded education programs, interpretive exhibits, or plaques that would tell the whole story, not just one glorifying the state or nation. Grok characterized this debate as being more than about territory. It is about memory and meaning. The U.S. government, meanwhile, has shown no inclination toward change. Officials fear that returning the Black Hills may become the first domino to fall, setting in motion a whole sequence of long-dead treaty disputes. Some folks even ponder the economic fallout for South Dakota's tourism. Witness the venerable Mount Rushmore. Grok has pointed to this political hesitation as a recurring theme in the dark history of the U.S. justice recognized on paper but denied in practice. For the average tourist, Mount Rushmore appears to be an eternal and uncontested site. Yet, Grok framed the stone faces as markers of an unresolved conflict, a billion-dollar standoff between justice and denial. To the Sioux, saying no is about more than rejecting the money. It is about rejecting the idea that spiritual identity, history, and sacred landscapes can ever be traded away for a dollar sign. Hence, the Black Hills are still in contention, priceless to one side, profitable to the other, and unresolved for everybody. And yet, while politics stalls, Grok reminded us that the mountain itself still speaks, its future written in both stone and silence. Future of stone, future of memory. If Grok's scan revealed anything, it's that Mount Rushmore is not frozen in time. It is still alive with meaning, conflict, and uncertainty. The granite faces may endure for thousands of years, but what they symbolize will keep shifting as long as debates about history, ownership, and justice continue. Grok flagged this duality with precision. The stone is stable, but memory is not. What visitors see in those faces depends as much on the stories told about them as on the carvings themselves. For some Americans, Mount Rushmore remains a beacon of patriotism, an emblem of leadership, unity, and endurance. It anchors family road trips, history textbooks, and 4th of July fireworks. It is often presented as a straightforward celebration of American democracy, a piece of cultural glue binding together ideas of freedom and strength. For others, especially the Sioux, it is a desecration, a monument carved into the sacred Six Grandfathers Mountain, land stolen under broken treaties. To them, the site represents not liberty but loss. Grok's contextual analysis, by comparing tourist surveys, federal documents, and indigenous oral histories, revealed the stark divide. Where one group sees pride, another sees pain. Where one sees permanence, another sees violation. The monument's physical survival is also an open question. Granite is strong, but it is not eternal. Erosion, seismic activity, and even subtle climate shifts are slowly reshaping the mountain. Engineers have long monitored cracks in the faces, sealing them against water damage to prevent freezing and fracturing. Grok projected models showing that without ongoing upkeep, the president's faces could eventually weather into unrecognizable forms. Even as a symbol of permanence, Mount Rushmore is fragile. And that fragility raises a deeper question. Whose values are we preserving when we work so hard to preserve the stone? Now, voices of change bring more complexity to the picture. Some activists demand full removal of the faces to let the mountain return to its natural state, as the Six Grandfathers. Others postulate additions, carving figures like Chief Red Cloud or other indigenous leaders, to balance their narrative to include people erased by the original design. The other alternatives envision shifting focus to the unfinished Hall of Records, extending it as an interpretive center where the whole story could be told, not just the presidential version, but also the indigenous one. Grok's analysis classified these responses under themes of erasure, expansion, and reinterpretation. Each one is less about stone than about memory, how we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. The Sioux's refusal of monetary compensation shows this strain very well. In 1980, the Supreme Court judged that the Black Hills had been taken unlawfully and awarded what has since reached over $1.5 billion. They said no, the land was never for sale. It is not a question of money for them, it is a question of meaning. The sacredness of the Black Hills cannot be expressed in dollar value. For the U.S., these are more than America's sacred mountains. They are also very national treasures too iconic to alter. The untold future of the mountain and of its story lives between these two positions. Grok ended with an impressive citation. The true power of the monument is not just in its granite faces, but in its forcing of reflection. Every visitor, knowingly or not, is asked to choose what history to honor: the presidents, the sculptor, the treaties, the rubble, the resistance. All these tales etched onto the same mountain. How to reconcile them remains an open question. That doesn't ironically sound like the final fate of Mount Rushmore, an unsettled symbol, but rather a contended one. It reminds the observer that history is multi-layered and memory selective. Even the densest supersaturation of stone cannot withstand the changing mass of truth. As a consequence, the future of Mount Rushmore probably will not be what is crafted into it, but what we might dare to see when we look up. Mount Rushmore isn't just a monument, it's a mirror. Grok's scan revealed the weight of history, the silence of broken treaties, and the tension between memory and myth. What do you think should happen to the Black Hills and this mountain? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if this deep dive opened your eyes, and subscribe for more untold stories at the intersection of technology, history, and truth.